Hello, and welcome to the nonprofit world. I'm Paula Sorrelsbean, and I'm here today with Terry Schmitt from the Women's League Child Development Center. Terry has a PhD in sociology from Yale University and his Master's of Divinity from Eden Theological Seminary and a Bachelor of Arts from Brown University. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you.
We want to talk a little bit today about the Women's League Child Development Center. And to get us started, would you just give us a little bit of history about yourself and then how you got involved with the Women's League Child Development Center?
That's especially important, Paula, because I'm just the temporary person there right at the moment. I am an interim executive director. They're between executive directors now. We had a long-term executive director, Iris Hope Rich, who was with Women's League for 17 years, and they're about to name a new one. I don't know. I know they're down to two people, and they're choosing one of the two. So that will be named probably, that person will take over in the first of the year. Okay. So part of what I do is I have come to them through an organization called Third Sector New England, or Mission Works, TSNE. And they support nonprofit organizations throughout the region. They're headquartered in Boston, but they provide all sorts of supports in a number of ways. Part of the effort to find new leadership at Women's League was sponsored by the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. So this is I mean, it is interesting we're on Nonprofits World Television because this is a real nonprofit story, a larger story. The Women's League story is, though, itself, I think, a fascinating one. I really feel privileged to be there with them. Iris was a wonderful, wonderful leader, but she follows the pathway of a lot of wonderful leaders at Women's League. Women's League has been in existence for exactly 100 years. It's celebrating its 100th anniversary, as a matter of fact, with a celebration dinner that will include not a lot of the people of the organization, but also many guests and a headliner, Anika Noni Rose, who is apparently a well-known television and movie and even Broadway star. I will admit she travels in a world that I don't, but she's coming and is our speaker and is a really a wonderful person. She's not a graduate or not an alum of Women's League, but she is a local person, even though she lives, I don't know where now, New York City or something like that, but she came from Bloomfield. She grew up in Bloomfield, so she's a local person who made good. And that's really, when you get right down to it, that's what Women's League is all about, is helping children make it in life. And we do that from a perspective of the importance, the significance of early childhood education. We have been doing it for a long time, as I say, for 100 years. It started sort of in a daycare kind of way and service to African American families that were moving up from the South for various construction and manufacturing jobs 100 years ago. But this organization is filled with firsts and as well as longevity. So it was probably one of the first places that dedicated itself to education of young children, not merely warehousing, not merely taking care of kids so that people could go to work. Right. They started that way, but really from the mid-1940s, they were focused on early childhood education. It is the first organization in a city dedicated to center city or urban populations that was accredited by NIAC, the National Association of Education for Young Children. And I know I happen to personally be on the board of what used to be a nursery school in my own church in West Hartford, and it has become an early childhood education facility as well. And it's got a nice long history, 75 years old as a nursery school. It got NIAC accreditation 2 years ago.
Wow.
whereas Women's League was accredited in 1991. So that just shows how dedicated they have been to this really incredibly important task.
Right, right. Well, I noticed that that from on your website that you talk about an early math program, and I thought that was really interesting. And can you tell us a little bit about that and how early you start these children on with math? Is that?
Well, I can tell you sort of yes and no.
Okay.
My answer to that is yes and no. Can I tell you the details of that? No.
Okay.
And I can't because I don't really know it all that well. I am the interim. I'm not, and also I have this incredibly wonderful assistant director named Stephanie Googe, and Stephanie is on top of all of those kinds of programs. What I will say, though, that may surprise a lot of people, and it goes hand in hand with the NIAC accreditation. Every single one of our classrooms, every grade level, has a curriculum, a specific curriculum for that grade level. That's how intense the educational aspect of what we do is. Now, if you walk into one of those classrooms, it's not going to look like a high school classroom in the sense of people are not going to be sitting down writing things, they're not going to be at desks. It's all play, it's all fun, but there is an incredible amount of purpose behind each of those fun activities, and it is guided by curricula. So let me be a little more specific. We have one classroom, only one, of infants. We have 8 classrooms of toddlers, and we have 8 more classrooms of preschool. So this is the largest facility, a single site facility of its kind in our region, possibly in the state. We have 260 kids in this. It's a large organization, and even though we only have one classroom, 8 kids who are infants, so we've got baby bassinets and, cribs and things like that all in there. Believe it or not, there is a curriculum for that classroom, for those children. So we work with them, we encourage them, whether it's a curriculum that involves crawling or recognition of colors or recognition of shapes. That's part of what we do. Every single child in our facility is evaluated on an ongoing basis to make sure we're helping them with all of the things that are going to make them successful in school. I come to this with a large background in public school education. I served on a school board for many, many years, and I can see what it's like for children in grade school and in middle school and in high school. And what that has convinced me of is the unbelievable importance of this preschool experience. We talk about the achievement gap in Connecticut. It's a large achievement gap in Connecticut. We're concerned about it. I don't know a school district in the state that isn't worried about dealing with that in one way or another. And I think about that as a school board member, as a former school board member. We probably can play catch up with some of those kids, probably, if we had an immense amount of money, if we had many more resources than we're willing to devote to it. We could do it. It's hard. It's possible. It's very, very hard and very expensive. Whereas if you give children, especially children from impoverished backgrounds who struggle with the environment, the richness of the environment they come from, if you give those children a very good early childhood experience, you help them develop emotionally and socially so that when they are in a public school setting or in a real school setting, they know how to respond and they have the confidence to do the work and they are willing to face the challenges because they faced challenges as little kids. I mean, as really little kids. These are really tiny people. But if you do the work then, it's a lot less expensive. It's a lot more effective. The children are much more able to adjust and to learn and to grow. I will say, this is all going back to your math question, I will admit, and the math question is trenchant, but what you will do with the math curriculum, and I don't know the specifics, as I say, but it probably has to do with assembly of blocks, with managing time, with counting the days of the week, with being aware of a calendar. Those are the kinds of things that would happen, and they happen naturally. And by the way, they continue in kindergarten and first grade and second grade, but we give children the first taste of that.
Okay.
I could go on. I can proselytize about this. I am a huge advocate of early childhood education. There are things that, as a sociologist, you mentioned that I'm a sociologist, that we sociologists are aware of that are really painful as a society for us to recognize. And they have to do with the enrichment that children of higher socioeconomic strata get in relationship to middle socioeconomic strata or really impoverished, the folks who are really struggling. And I will tell you that the Women's League has always sought to serve the neediest people. One of the things that we insist on, well, let's even take it a step back from that. Everybody in education is aware that the number one factor for any successful educational experience is a parent or a family member. If you have a family member that cares and supports and pushes and encourages, you have a successful child or you have a much greater potential for a successful child. But it's often very difficult to engage parents. That's true in the it was true in the public schools, and I don't care what environment you're in socioeconomically, it's still tough to get some parents involved. So one of the things that we do is we make sure we see parents every single week. And we do that because we force everybody to pay something. And so they have to come in, because for many of our parents, even the very small amount of money that we insist on a weekly basis is a struggle. But because we see them, we're in touch with them, we are cognizant of the struggles that they're facing, and we can always keep them informed about the reality that their children are facing, so we can engage the parents, and we think that's really key. But what we're dealing with is we're trying to overcome what are real deficits that happen because of the different environments that these children are in. So going back to what I was saying as a sociologist, and I'm going to get the statistics wrong, but the concepts behind the statistics are absolutely correct, which is that the higher you go socioeconomically, the more likely you're going to be in a word-rich environment. So the vocabulary that a preschool child will hear from their parents if they're at upper middle class level is something along the lines of 4 times as expansive as what a child in our group will hear. So they'll be hearing 4 times as many different words. It's a much richer environment for them to be able to begin the thoughts that lead to reading. Reading is, well, and here's the point. Scientists tell us now that and it makes perfect sense to us, that our language abilities as human beings is pretty much hardwired into us. One of the things that makes us human is that we talk, and that differentiates us from animals. So that's kind of hardwired in. We're all pretty good at talking. Reading is a very, very new reality for most of humanity and most of the human condition. So that's not hardwired into us. That's a struggle. There's a learning curve there that's different. And the richer you create a word environment for children, and the more that you immediately give children the notion that there are these things called letters that equate to this wild set of words that you can give them, the more able they are to begin reading. So we don't require that our children read by the time they leave as 4-year-olds of us, but we want them to be ready to read, to be prepared. So that's the stuff that makes sense, and that's true. The kind of issues of reading and facing that are true no matter where you are socioeconomically. But our folks come from an environment that's not very rich in vocabulary, in concept. It's much more narrow. And that's just what we sociologists have discovered out there, unfortunately. Now, here's the part that's really painful to me. And I say this sort of from all of my backgrounds. What is co-equally true about the difference as you go up the socioeconomic scale is the kinds of words that children hear. And the intent behind those words is dramatically different. So children at the upper end of the socioeconomic scale are hearing 4 times as many positive words as negative words. Things like good job, or isn't that wonderful, or it's nice to see you, or thank you. Those are words that kids at the upper scale are hearing on a regular basis multiples of times in comparison to negative things like don't do that, don't touch that. The lower you go down the socioeconomic scale, almost exactly like the reading issues, the fewer positive words, till by the time you deal with the children that are our population, it's 2 to 1 negative. Twice as many negative words as positive words.
Tough. Yeah.
It's very tough. So we have lots of volunteers that come to our organization. United Way provides us with volunteers from different companies and different groups, and others that are interested will come to us. And I always tell them, I said, look, if you do nothing more today, if you do nothing more than say something positive to a child, you will have made an important impact on that child's life. So we work consciously, intentionally to provide as many positive reinforcements as we possibly can to the children. And that's not just because we want to create a Pollyanna world for them.
Right.
It's because if you hear positive words, then you're more ready and willing to take on a risk, to work at a task, to take on that next challenge. If your whole life is filled with negativity of don't do that, you can't do this, get in line, and a bunch of other things, you enter your school experience afraid to try and not necessarily believing that you can do. Our children leave our facility aware that they have the capability and the desire to succeed, that they can succeed and that they'll get supported in their efforts to succeed. So that's
wonderful.
It's a nonstop effort, that's for sure.
That's wonderful. Terry, you have some experience with at Yale working with nonprofit organizations. Can you tell us about that, and also how things are different in the nonprofit world today?
Well, that's an intriguing issue. Yes, I did spend some time at Yale working with an organization called the Program on Nonprofit Organizations, and I was specifically investigating. I was in charge of a research project that looked at religious nonprofits and religious organizations as nonprofit organizations, and also in comparison to other organizations like for-profit organizations. And there are a number of things that are similar across those fields, but a lot of people hadn't taken into account religious organizations in terms of the nonprofit world. A little bit strange when you think about it, but religion always gets categorized and kind of shoved off to the side. Nonprofits tend to think more along the lines of United Way or maybe a food drive somewhere, or I'm trying to think of some others. I mean, like Food Share here would be a perfect example. That's not religiously based, but it involves itself. The religious community is involved in it. Anyway, they tend to think about this nonprofit world as a totally secular world. But the reality is that our our country, wonderful as it is, and it is wonderful in its generosity, in individuals' generosity. We give a lot of money. We give a lot of money to schools, which are nonprofit organizations. We give a lot of money to United Way. We give a lot of money to soup kitchens. I've just mentioned those. There's a lot of arts organizations. We give money to arts organizations. I'm a big fan of the Hartford Symphony Orchestra. That's a nonprofit organization that raises money and does an effective job, a wonderful job. It just turned a profit for the first time in ages. It's made money a little bit. Those are all wonderful kinds of things. And yet, the reality is 80% of the money that goes to nonprofits goes to religion, goes to religious nonprofits. The vast majority of money that people give, they give in an offering envelope on a Sunday morning, or on a Saturday or a Friday night at their synagogue or temple, or at their gurdwara on a Saturday or Sunday if they're Sikhs, or at a Hindu temple when the Hindus go, and they can go all sorts of different times, or at a meal that the Baha'i are holding on to. And I mention all of those because those are active communities here in Connecticut, active religious communities, and they get the majority of nonprofit dollars. But nobody had looked at those organizations as organizations. And it turns out there are some unique things about them, and there are some things that are typical of every other nonprofit organization. But I think you asked finally about what's different and what's changed. The nonprofit world is a constantly changing world. The vast majority of nonprofits are less than 20 years old. And that's because the way that the environment changes is a need comes up, and we Americans start a nonprofit. You can go all the way back to Alexis de Tocqueville, who said that these Americans, they're organizing all the time. Something comes up and they organize a committee to do something about it. That's very strange. He, coming from Europe, thought that was unusual, and that was already a hallmark of the American culture in the early 19th century. So that's what we do. And that's why the nonprofit world changes, because a problem comes up, it was, in my lifetime, in your lifetime, the AIDS crisis came up, that a whole bunch of organizations cropped up to educate, to support individuals, to lobby. Those are all nonprofit kinds of activities, and all these different organizations cropped up. Well, they've all, not all, but many of them have dropped back because it's not the crisis now that it was 30 years ago. So new crises have emerged, and so a perfect example of this is, and I don't know that there's all sorts of organizations that have cropped up, but they're certainly thriving right at the moment. We have a refugee crisis internationally, and so people are gathering together and organizing themselves to help with the refugee crisis in whatever way they can. So they're organizing themselves, and some of them will do things. There's a major organization in New Haven called IRIS that works. It's the International Refugee and Immigration Services Organization, and it helps provide for the support system so that local groups can help with refugees, because there are major refugee crises all over the world. I know in my town of West Hartford, a number of committees cropped up, came into being in response to that horrific picture that we remember of the little 4-year-old boy that washed up on the Greek shore and was being picked up by a police officer, and he had drowned. All these people said, we need to do something. Well, we do that through nonprofits. We don't go to our government and say, fix it. We certainly don't go to our corporations and say, there should be a corporation to do this. We do that by organizing ourselves into nonprofits. So the nonprofit world is constantly changing, growing, adapting, responding to the needs that are out there, and very effectively. well, I was going to mention hurricanes and hurricane relief. There are old established organizations like the Red Cross that reach out to those, but there are also the new efforts that crop up in many cases. So I'll let you ask a question in a second, but that leads me back to Women's League, because Women's League is really unusual in that it's 100 years old. It's been at what it's doing for a century, and in the nonprofit world, that is very, very unusual.
Yeah. So you've been directly involved with nonprofits for a while. So if you could imagine the world without nonprofits, or the United States without nonprofits, what would that look like?
Well, I can't imagine a world without nonprofits. It's a part of our culture, and the one thing that you change with the most difficulty is culture, and I think it's inherent in who we are as citizens in this country. We talk about being individuals and individualists, but what we mean by that is that we feel free to do things. We don't necessarily take no for an answer. We certainly don't take anybody saying, well, that's impossible for an answer, especially in relationship to problems. So whereas other cultures and other countries may turn to government because that's what's appropriate for them to solve problems, and they would work individually or through, say, political parties to affect government policies. That's one thing we do here too. We certainly, there's nothing wrong with that. But that doesn't limit us. We don't feel limited in the United States. We're not waiting for somebody else always to tell us what to do. We feel empowered as citizens to do things ourselves, and certainly to respond to people in need. I was thinking about a woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, a number of years ago. She was from Vermont. And she started a nonprofit organization to fight for the removal of landmines. What I remember, because this isn't universal and it's not. The people do not feel empowered the same way in every part of the United States or at every time. But there is something about Vermont, and maybe there's something about New England too, and maybe Connecticut's got some of this as well. That people look at each other and say, well, there's this problem of landmines that are that warring countries, including our own, have left in places all over the world, whether it's in Vietnam or it's in regions around South Africa or the Horn of Africa. They're in a lot of places, unfortunately. Anyway, here she was in Vermont, and she kind of, I had the sense that she looked around and said, well, I've got a friend over here, another person over here. We can change the world. And she did. That's, I think, a part of the American spirit. We see a problem. We are not going to say, I'm not going to do something about that. If we feel really compelled to do so, we're going to try. And we do that through nonprofit organizations by and large, because we can organize. We have a tax code right at the moment that supports our efforts in that. We have routines that we can follow. We know what the drill is pretty much, or we know we can turn to people who know how to manage that. It's unusual to find old nonprofit organizations, and they do tend to be responsive to specific problems. We used to laugh at Yale. There's a whole group called the medical nonprofits. And the medical nonprofits, it's their own unique operation in many ways, and they're supporting usually around a specific disease. They'll organize themselves. So the largest in the country, intriguingly enough, is one hospital, St. Jude's Hospital, or it's one of the largest. It's in the top 5 at any rate. And is working on one disease, or I mean, it's actually a lot of diseases, but it's all cancer. They are working to end and eradicate childhood cancer, and they do an unbelievable job of fundraising and of work that's cutting edge on dealing with issues surrounding childhood cancer. That one in particular got a big boost because Danny Thomas was affiliated with them and associated with them for many, many years. So if I'm dating you, the fact that you smile dates you too. So I'm dating myself with that reference.
Yeah.
But one of the things that was funny at Yale is we would find that occasionally, very occasionally, a medical nonprofit will actually solve its problem, and you would think then that it would go out of existence, but at least in one case, and I can't remember which one it was, so I'm not going to get myself into trouble by naming the wrong one, but one of them really, they developed an answer to the disease that they were fighting. This makes me think this might have been polio, because the Salk vaccine came along, and then there was the Sabin vaccine. At any rate, that was an organization that just pivoted and found another disease. And I don't remember which one the name of the organization, but they pivoted. That's very unusual. That's extremely there's a problem if you get to the point where you really have felt that the problem is over or is managed, your nonprofit tends to go away and people go in a different direction. It's not as if we've run out of problems.
Right, right. Well, changing roles, from your role as a minister, what do you feel the relationship is between religion and helping others?
That's interesting, because there's sort of a theological or a conceptual answer to that. There's also an organizational answer, which I think is kind of intriguing. So the theological one's probably the easiest one. Almost every major religion has as a significant component helping other people. And maybe it's more narrow sometimes in helping our other people, but there are needy people within our own religion. Generally speaking, it's helping a lot of other people. There was a major dinner a few weeks ago that was called a Love Thy Neighbor Dinner. And it noted that of a whole bunch of different religions, and I mean very different religions, Hindus and Jews and Muslims and Sikhs and Baha'is, that loving thy neighbor was a component in each one of their religions. And that didn't say neighbors who look like me or religion or have the same religion as I do. Our neighbors, whoever our neighbors are. So I think many religions have at their hearts a component that says that we have an obligation to our neighbor. Certainly Christianity has that as clear as a bell. You can't get any clearer than Jesus' words to the Sadducee who was trying to trip him up and of course failed. That you have these great commandments, loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. So it's very clear there. It's also very clear in many other religions as well. And they have significant components. Jews every year at the time of the high holy days in the fall, part of their component is to do a mitzvah for someone else. It is inherent in their practices and in their faith. For Islam, there is an absolute commitment to helping others and to helping others beyond not just Muslims, but others, whoever the other is. So it's not hard to make a leap from our faith to our actions to help other people. And I see it in all sorts of interesting ways. I'm going to give you an example that's kind of a strange one to me, but it's a powerful one. To me, there is a Christian organization, the Mormon Church in the Farmington area. And they gave $10,000 to a Muslim mosque to help pay for a security system. because there are people who are Muslims who are under attack and very concerned. Now, apart from being outrageously generous, which it was, it's a sign that our faith helps us in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, helps us see the other as someone who is deserving of our concern. No matter who the other is, no matter how we define that, they're part of our call to do God's work when we're here on earth. So that's the conceptual idea, and as I say, I think it's pretty universal, or it's at least widely shared. There's also an organizational component, which I've found interesting, and you can look at this. You can parse it out by denomination in some ways, Christian denomination, but also Jews or Muslims or others. In that you will find that some organizations disproportionately populate the leadership of nonprofit organizations. And they do so because that's part of their religious heritage. So my denomination, I'm a member of the United Church of Christ, which is Congregationalists in background. Well, Congregationalists have populated the leadership of nonprofit organizations from, say, the founding of Harvard on. Because that was the part of the conceptual framework of Congregationalism. You have a congregation here, the people run the church, run that church, and oh, by the way, you should be running other things that carry on the work and the ministry in other ways as well. Not controlled by the church, but populated by people who care about the church. So you will find Jewish people in many places involved in nonprofit organizations for exactly the same reasons, because their faith teaches them that it isn't just about being in the synagogue or in the temple, it's about doing the work of the faith out in all these other organizations as well. And I think that's true I'm not as well versed in other religions and denominations as that, but those are two pretty good examples.
Okay. Well, in the global world that we live in, how important do you think it is that we reach out to people in other nations, in other parts of the world?
We really are.
Our own environment.
We are getting pretty far afield from poor old Women's League. Well, personally, I think that it's extremely important. I also think it's organizationally hard in the United States. Again, just mention an environmental concern or an environmental issue. We're in the United States. We have on our borders, we have 4 borders, basically. 2 of those borders are named the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. So we don't really have to deal with the rest of the world when we've got 2 borders like that. We have 2 other borders, Mexico and Canada. Those are extremely friendly nations to us. So it takes effort and energy for people in our country who don't interface with other nations and people from other nations on a daily basis, and don't have to worry about invasion from other places, at least not physically. The tech world may change this, but it's very hard. It's just hard for us to do because it's not part of our daily life. So I went on a mission trip to Turkey 30 or so years ago on behalf of my Board for World Ministries, and I got to Turkey and realized it was surrounded by 9 countries, all historic enemies of Turkey. So if you're in a situation where you're surrounded by people who may indeed have invaded your country before, with whom you have dealings on a daily basis, who can have an impact on the reality of your life on a daily basis, you're probably going to pay much more attention to people from other countries and other cultures than you are in the United States, where we have the luxury of not really having to worry about it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't. Now, moved on to that, and the notion of what's happening in the cyber world, where we can have a dramatic impact on a culture completely removed from us physically, without ever leaving our room, that may change things. It's certainly the technology has always changed human reality. So the invention of the printing press led to the Gutenberg Bible and led to Protestantism. You can make relationships there. I'm not a historian, but I mean, it's not hard to see the interrelationship between a technological change that led to a major social change, social and religious change as well. So we have an internet that allows us to do and see and create things immediately in ways that we never have before. I have a daughter right at the moment in Singapore. The biggest problem I have with communicating with her is that it's 13 hours different than us. That's it. Beyond that, I can pick up my smartphone and be in touch with her for free right now.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah,
yes.
It is.
Totally amazing.
So that technology does change the environment that we're in. And it will, I mean, going back to nonprofits, it changes the reality of nonprofits.
Right.
Changes fundraising, it changes ability to do things, it changes the impact of incidents. So yeah, things could change. We may become more international because of the internet, both for good and for ill.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the Women's League.
First of all, you'll notice that I'm white. Women's League has a number of firsts and in some ways onlys. It was one of the first organizations, nonprofit organizations in Hartford, founded by African Americans for African Americans. It absolutely was the first African American nonprofit organization that got money from the United Way. Now, at the time, it was the Community Chest, but the point was we've had a relationship with the United Way and with other nonprofits in the larger community that goes back 75 or more years. The organization works, I would say 98% of our population are African American or other minority children there, and our staff is largely minority population as well. And certainly our board, which is wildly integrated in all sorts of ways, but it still has people on it that are African American. So I'm really an interloper in certain kinds of ways, and that may change. I don't know who they've chosen to be the person following me, but I am sure that the African American community, which has supported this organization for all of its 100 years, will continue to support this organization as well as benefit from this organization, which it does in all sorts of really critical ways.
How do people get involved with, I mean, how do people know about the Women's League Child Development Center? How would they contact you? How would they get in touch with the school to find out if their children would be eligible to attend there?
So, what's the answer that everybody gives today about everything? Go look on the internet, type in Women's League Child Development Center. You'll get to us right away if you at least get to Women's League Child. Will get to us. If you just leave it at Women's League, you're going to wind up with a Women's League of Voters, and that's important too, but it's not us. So Women's League Child Development Center will get you to us, and that's a portal into all of our activities and into getting in touch with us. And I would recommend that be the best way. In a lot of ways, because again, I'm only the interim. I won't be there for all that much longer. People come and call, people come by, people visit, people call. But to be perfectly honest with you, the reality is that most of us don't know an organization like this exists. The point where we start thinking about it is when we have a child. So when your child is just born, and up to age 4, you're going to get very interested in this kind of organization. After that, not so much. Before that, probably completely off your radar screen. I didn't know all that much about Women's League, even though I was very involved in the educational community in the whole region and very aware of all sorts of things. I wasn't as plugged into early childhood. You tend to get plugged in when you really need the services. So that's one way. It's on the website. You're going to do that when you really are interested. And the other reality is there's a lot of word of mouth. We are very much committed to our community, our local community. People in the neighborhood know about us for all sorts of good reasons. They know about us. One of those reasons is the longevity of our staff, of many people on our staff. So we have teachers and other personnel who've been there, who count their years of service in decades, not in years. So they're known in the community, and it gets passed down. But I didn't know anything about it until I came, I have to admit.
So how did you end up at the Child Development Center?
Well, their longstanding leader, executive director, Iris Hope Rich, who'd been there for 17 years, had to retire, had some medical issues, and knew it was time to retire. And she reached out to the Hartford Foundation, and the Hartford Foundation said, well, we'll help you with the transition, but here's another organization, Third Sector New England, or it's now called Mission Works, TSNE. They're up in Boston, but they have resources. One of their resources is they have a group of people who do interim executive directors. You should call them and work with them, and they'll send you a couple people. So they I guess, got a bunch of resumes, and they looked through the resumes, and they picked several people to interview, and they interviewed me, and I wound up there. I've said to the staff many times that my job, well, let me put it this way. Iris Hope Rich was just a wonderful, wonderful leader. Apart from the fact that she was very, very bright and organizationally very savvy. This is Women's League, apart from everything else, it is one of the financially healthiest organizations I've ever been in. And she did all that. She was just wonderful. So what the point in that is that a transition to a new person is going to be painful for the staff and difficult. So I have told the staff numerous times that it's my job to demonstrate to them what a really crummy executive director looks like. and that way when the new executive director comes in, they will be so relieved to have the new permanent executive director that I will have done my job and made the transition possible so that they've had a good one. In fact, they've had a spectacular one. Everybody loves Iris. Apart from the fact of all of the wonderful things she did, everybody loves her. So the new person isn't going to have that advantage. Iris built that up over 17 years. Any organizational transition is difficult, and especially after a long term like that. So my job was to help say, you're going to get a new reality, you're going to be in a new place, and the new person isn't going to be like Iris, and they're not going to be like me, with any luck at all. They're not going to be like me, and you'll be happy with them. I think I've accomplished that part of it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's always tough when you're transitioning, especially when the person that's been in that role is dynamic and has just done a tremendous amount for the organization. Yeah. So that's always a transitional
Iris,
time.
Everywhere I go in early childhood throughout the state, whether I'm meeting a commissioner or a nonprofit leader or something, or the person who runs what used to be the nursery school in my church, they say immediately, "Oh, Iris, she's so wonderful." It's universal. That's everybody says that. So they all adore her. They all miss her. They all respect her. And all of that is kind of baked into where Women's League is right now.
Okay. Is there anything else about the Child Development Center that you would like to share with us? Any other? Let's see, we've talked about some of the, do you have any information on any of the programming that they offer?
Well, I do. One of the things that I want to say actually is about programming, about curriculum. I really didn't emphasize this quite enough. when we think about school, we almost immediately think in terms of academics and achievement, and I'm fine with that in all sorts of ways. And then we think about early childhood education, and we might sort of lay the same kinds of guidelines or rubrics on top of what early childhood education means or what the goal is. Growing evidence throughout public school education, and regardless of age, actually, is emphasizing social and emotional development as the absolute hallmark, the absolute foundation of all the rest of your educational experience. And that is something that the Women's League has for many, many years, decades, embraced as a critical goal. What you have is children from from some difficult environments, difficult home environments, or even just impoverished environments. I mean, if your parent or parents are worried about whether they have enough money to pay for the rent and for the food, their capacity to care in the most creative way for their child is compromised. Everybody's is compromised in that way. As soon as you add stress to a family situation above the stress that we all experience, it makes it tougher. So Women's League has been really focused on the importance of social and emotional development for kids that probably, or that sometimes and even oftentimes, haven't had the attention to those kinds of issues. How do you relate to another child? How do you work in a team? How do you do things together? How do you play with each other as opposed to individually or off on your own? How do you share as opposed to own? How do you do the things that make it possible to be successful? How do you have the confidence that the next thing that comes along is something that you can do? Those are emotional issues. Those are social issues, and yet they're crucial issues. They're crucial issues for school success. They're crucial issues for life success. And you know, one of the things we haven't done, I wish we would, I mean, it's one of the things I hope we can work on, is compile a list of our alumni. It's kind of hard. We're letting go of kids at age 4, and then they disappear. And to be perfectly honest, when they get to be an age where they might remember that they were a student here, they don't remember any other students. They don't remember other kids. So you can't build up a network very easily. You just have to find one accidentally. But what I want to see is I want to see the success stories. I want to find out. Now, I know a couple, as a matter of fact. Sean Wooden, who was the head of the city council in Hartford, is a graduate of Women's League. And he's a lawyer with a major law firm in Hartford. So obviously a success story. And of course, we're going to claim that as our own. There's another guy, and this one is a fun one. There's kind of a fun story with this one. There's a group that the Hartford Foundation has put together called a Black Giving Circle, which is a really neat group where they invite African Americans to come together and contribute a certain amount of money to Hartford Foundation, and then join this giving circle where they study other nonprofits that they focus on to give all of their pooled money, basically. And they had a meeting, at Women's League, one of the places they came to visit, but they had a meeting there, an organizing meeting and all of that stuff. And the second guy actually that got up, they have co-chairs for the Black Giving Circle. So the second guy got up was a guy by the name of Daryl Thames. He is just re-elected to the Board of Education in Manchester. He works with Goodwill Industries, I think down in New Haven. But obviously a successful guy who knows how to give back to the community in all sorts of ways. And his opening words were, as he looked around, he said, "This is where I started." I said, more years ago than I want to tell you, but this is where I started at Women's League. So I know there are success stories out there. We don't have them compiled as well as I would like to. I'd like to put a few more together because I think that we could demonstrate pretty conclusively that starting at Women's League can have a very, very positive effect on your whole life, not just on whether you learn to read by grade 3, which I expect kids reading by grade 1, but your whole life. So, and I think that's what we do. That's why, I mean, I can't tell you that, I mean, the Wall Street Journal cited some research, and this is a couple of years old, but they cited some research that said the best educational dollar spent today is on early childhood education. You want bang for your buck, early childhood education is where you do it.
Yeah, it would be nice to be able to measure how, you know, the students that have been at the Child Development Center with the Women's League, as opposed to those who haven't, to have some type of measurement. So I hope you can find more of those people that have attended there over the past years.
Yeah. Interestingly, the United Way supports Women's League generously and appropriately because we are right in line with their mission. They came for a site visit last year, and they were asking about, well, how do you know the effects and the results, and you know, who do you talk to afterwards? And I said to them, I said, you know. Every school district and every school organization is dying for that kind of information. And if you folks want to fund a study that would enable it, I'd be thrilled. And they would too, because everybody wants to know what happens afterwards. But who's got the money to devote to that when there's so many needs that are right there in your face for that day, with kids that are right in front of you? So anyway.
Well, Terry, tell us again how people can get in touch with the Women's League Child Development Center.
I would go to any search engine and type in Women's League Child Development Center, and we will pop up, and then go to our website. That's the best way to get to us. You can get an email to me from that. The telephone numbers are there. We're located at 1695 Main Street in Hartford, in the Clay Arsenal section. We're right across the street from the Sand Public School. Let's see what else. We're not all that far from Dunkin' Donuts Park. So come and visit us sometime. Knock on the door, and the door is on Sims Street, which is on the side, where even though our address is Main Street, we're actually on a side. The main entrance is on a side street, but come by.
Okay, great. Terry, thank you so much for being here with us today. That is Terry Schmitt with the Women's League Child Development Center. And thank you for joining us today for the Nonprofit World.